Hello, a huge welcome to BLOXHUB, our fifth event in the series of healthy buildings, happy hearts and minds. I am Pernille Berg, Science Manager of BLOXHUB, and I am delighted to welcome you to our Science Talks today. Let me just, before I introduce our eminent speakers, say thank you also to the partners behind this series. I'd like to thank you Velux, PropTech, Climate, Danish Sound Cluster, Velux, Realdania, Lys Technologies, Build, Aalborg University, for collaborating and cooperating with us to make sure that we can provide you with not just relevant and hot, brilliant events and debates. Today we have not only a science talks, we also have a debate later today. So stay with us because you're in for some really hot stuff. And as you can see from today's title, we are addressing what is the part of our global pandemic, namely the COVID virus. But we're looking at it from a new perspective, namely the indoor air quality, ventilation, and Atze Boerstra is providing us with his latest insights. And Atze, I have looked so much forward to welcoming you because not many people have the coolest title as feelgoodbuilding specialist, but you do. Not only have you a history of collaborating closely with Velux, you have also studied at the Danish Technical University, if I remember correctly, in Copenhagen. So you're a dear friend of us. You have collaborated in the Active House specification document, so you know the Danish context. Today, you are also assistant professor at Delft University. You are managing director at BBA, and I hope to say correctly, Milieu, and then you're vice president of REHVA. So to have you here today is a real testament to the relations that you have with us in Denmark, because you are truly busy, you're hardworking, and you are constantly seeking out the latest insights and knowledge on indoor climate. So I, for one, have really looked forward to today and to your presentation. For those of you watching, you're joining us from all over the world, and for that, I'd like to thank you, because there's no fun in arranging such a science talks without your support. So thank you for supporting us, being faithful, and joining us today for this science talks. You may, if you haven't, I can help you. We have a chat function on the YouTube stream, and I have a wonderful colleague, Helle, who will take your questions. So feel free to pose your comments and questions, and I will try to make sure that we actually have time for your questions. So without further ado, Atze, I'm going to let you take the floor, as it were. And again, a huge welcome to you for our science talks today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pernille, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to have this science talk. And it's always good to be in Denmark. I think I've been in Copenhagen 15 times or something, and like you said, I studied there when I was a master student, and I've always kept in contact with both Aalborg University and Danish Technical University. So it's really good to be here. And what I would like to do today is to share some thoughts with the participants about indoor air quality, ventilation, and COVID. And I'm doing this with reference to a lot of work we've done with a group within REHVA. REHVA is the European Federation of Heating, Ventilation, and Air Conditioning Associations. And like DANVAC, for example, they are also a member of REHVA. Actually, Felix is also a supporter of REHVA, so it's a close cooperation with many parties. And from March last year, we started to look at this issue, indoor air and COVID, and we actually came up with some guidance that I'll talk about later. So if we do talk about indoor air quality and ventilation, what are the main issues? Before I dive into specifically COVID, I would like to say a few more general things about indoor air quality. Indoor air quality, or IAQ, of course, stands for quality of the air within buildings, and of course relates to pollutants indoors, of people exposed to pollutants indoors, and often with effect to their health and comfort. This could be positively or negatively. IAQ is not the same as indoor environmental quality, IEQ. IEQ, indoor environmental quality, that stands for the combination of indoor air quality, thermal climate, light and acoustics. So again, today we're going to focus on air, on indoor air. What kind of pollutants are we looking at if you talk about indoor air? Of course, today a lot of the focus will be on viruses, influenza virus, and especially COVID, coronaviruses. But other aspects one could talk about if you talk about indoor air quality is combustion products like carbon monoxide. You could look at chemicals. Actually, these are all stuff I first learned at the DTU. I'm certainly realizing now. Professor Vanger, for example, at the time was very busy with the chemical emissions. You can talk about particles, man-made mineral fibers, radon, molds, bacteria, and of course CO2. This is something people release when they breathe in, breathe out. I'd like to remind you that on a daily basis, people inhale about 10 cubic meter of air. And whether this air, the air that you inhale is clean and healthy and free of dangerous pollutants, that actually influences a lot. I mean, it can really influence how you feel, and it can actually, think of carbon monoxide, for example, it can be lethal within a couple of minutes even. And of course, also if the air is good, it can make you feel very active and can really influence your well-being in a very positive way. And again, this 10 cubic meter of air that you breathe in is really important. It's a lot compared to the amount of water, for example, you drink during a day. Then if you talk about indoor air quality, the next question is, okay, how does it affect people? For example, you can have effect on allergies. There have been a lot of studies, especially in Sweden and Denmark, where they looked at young children and how living, for example, in a moldy home affects health and also lung development over time. You can talk about skin, eye, nose, throat irritation, what we used to call ziekbuilding symptoms, sygebuggingen, I think that's called in Danish. Of course, there are long-term effects. Think of lung cancer. Nervous system effects, like if you are in bad air for a long time, this could actually create headaches, for example. Especially if you look at traffic-related particles and chemicals, you can talk about cardiovascular effects. I think it can trigger, for example, heart attacks in extreme situations. And another important effect, and you probably all have learned about this, is effect on task performance and learning performance in schools. In that context, I think it's good to mention that, especially in Denmark, there have been a lot of studies, also in Japan, for example, in the US, about productivity. This is just one example, but at DTU, Paul Wagocki, he's done a lot of studies looking at task performance in offices, but also learning performances in schools. And the picture to the right is just a picture from a recent study they did there. But the figure on the left, this is one of the studies where they looked at whether people were satisfied or dissatisfied with the air. And of course, they changed when they put people in climate chambers. They changed the air quality, they changed fresh air supply. And then in different situations, they gave people specific tasks. And then, of course, they measured how productive, how good their task performance was. And of course, here you can see that there's a relation between air quality, in this case perceived air quality, and task performance. And if you really want to make, for example, office environments where people perform well, you need good light, you need good sound, but you also need an adequate amount of fresh air and good indoor air quality. The next thing, I would like to go back to the other aspects, so task performance is not the main subject today. Let's look at more general about indoor air quality and ventilation. Often when I talk to people about good air quality, then they say like, well, isn't it just a matter of just ventilating a lot, then you get good indoor air quality? Well, it's not that simple. For example, if you're in a very polluted environment, maybe somewhere in China, in Paris, or specific close to industry, big industry, then of course, if you ventilate more without filtering the air, then actually to ventilate more will make the air inside worse. So it's not that simple. You should look at ventilation, yes, maybe air filtration, but you should also think about source strength. So if you have, for example, a home where there's a lot of mold on all the walls, you can ventilate all you want, but there's a source in there that you should take out. And just ventilation is, it's not just about ventilation. If you want good air quality, you should look at sources, about exposure time, for example, and it's not just ventilation. And yes, ventilation is one of the important aspects. Let's dive into the subject COVID. And you probably have seen articles here and there, maybe items on TV, especially half a year ago, 8 months ago, there were very harsh discussions about whether if you put people in a room, one of them is infected, whether they can only infect others if you become closer than 1.5 meters because of the big droplets, or whether they also can be infected if they stay further away, but when the room is not too big and is not ventilated very well. So aerosols versus large droplets. Well, that's actually one of the main subjects of today. To be honest, in my home country, we still go on with this discussion, and others, luckily, they are a little bit further and they already have decided that we should look at both separately. For example, Germany. If you do talk about infectious diseases, airway diseases, and ventilation, this is something people have talked about ages and ages already, actually also before what I'm going to show here. One example is Florence Nightingale. Many know her as just a nurse who walked around with a lamp taking care of wounded soldiers. But in real life, she also really into science, into finding solutions, she had a good network of people who worked in science. And she actually wrote a couple of booklets. One is it's called Notes on Hospitals. And in these booklets, she really advocates what she calls the environmental theory. And this theory basically says that if you want to make healthy interiors, you have to look at clean water, pure water. At the time, of course, they had a lot of problems with cholera, for example. You have to look at efficient drainage. So if people go to the toilet, you want to make sure that the waste is going away and doesn't stay in the building. You want cleanliness, so people have to wash their hands, etc. You have to clean the floors quite often. And you have to make sure there's adequate light coming in. She was indirectly kind of referring to UV effect from natural light. But first and for all, she states that you should also make sure that spaces are ventilated well. If you don't do that, then people can actually give each other certain infectious diseases. At the time, of course, they didn't know everything we do know now. They hadn't heard of RNA or DNA. But anyhow, based on what she observed, she came to the conclusion that if you want to fight infectious diseases, one of the things you should do is make sure there's fresh air, that you ventilate spaces well. At the main time, to be honest, it was not just her, because around that same time, 1850, 1860, for example, in Germany, and I think also in Scandinavia, had this movement called the hygienists, and they also looked at the importance of clean water and ventilation, etc. So it's not just her, and not just the English that were looking at this. Fast forward to where we live now. This is actually a study from beginning of 2020, a Chinese study from somebody called Shen. And this is more or less the start of the COVID epidemic. And this is one study that they described quite in detail. And the study is about ventilation and about aerosols. And what you see on the picture is a bus. A bus drives from left to right. And the Red Cross was somebody who was infected. They found out later. They drove about 50 minutes to one location, and then there were no infections. They could retract that. And then they drove back 50 minutes. So in this 2 times 50 minutes, people infected each other. So you can see that about half of the people were infected. All the red squares is somebody who got infected. And the strange thing is that some of these people were sitting more than 10 meters away from the infected person, and still they were infected with COVID, and others that were sitting right next to the person were not infected. So these kind of studies tell you that In certain situations, there is long distance transmission, and in this specific case, they found out that the bus driver had put the ventilation system in recirculation mode. So a lot of the time when the bus was driving, there was more or less no ventilation. They were just recirculating the air, and this probably explains why so many people got infected in so little time. And I'm not saying that buses are dangerous, because new buses have pretty good ventilation systems with very good filters, and often if you don't put them in recirculation mode, often it's quite a lot of fresh air coming in. But in this specific case, this went wrong. If you look at other super spreading events, you've all seen this in the newspapers. So we had, for example, in Western Germany and in the Netherlands, a lot of carnival. You see to the right, carnival parties where after a couple of weeks, a lot of people in that specific area where they do celebrate carnival, this is only in the south of the Netherlands, a lot of people were infected. Down to the left, you see a picture from Chorus, a group of people, this is in the US, in the state of Washington, were having singing practice, and then one of them was infected, and then afterwards about 70 or 80% also received it. It was not a super small space, about two times the size of a classroom, and still about 70% of people were infected. And we know of other examples from Asia where people were doing a karaoke, for example, in relatively small spaces, and in Austria, for example, where they had after ski parties in restaurants, small bars. And if you look at what these situations described in the literature often have in common, is that you see a lot of people per square meter. And again, these are incidences from the beginning of the epidemic, but they still can teach us things, I think. Lots of people, not super large spaces, often not super high ceilings. In many cases, mediocre or hardly any fresh air supply. Sometimes a lot of recirculation. And very often lots of talking, shouting, and singing. For example, you had a couple of nightclubs in Berlin where they had problems. And in a nightclub, if you have background music, people start to shout to each other. They get even closer to each other than they normally do. And of course, then you can, especially if you also look at the larger droplets, it's quite easy to infect each other. So a lot of background noise will trigger that people talk much louder than normal. And the harder you talk, the more aerosols you spread. And if you are infected, the more viruses you spread. This is actually, if you talk compared to not talking, it's like a factor of 10 difference in terms of aerosols and viruses. And if you shout or sing in related to just sitting quiet, it could be a factor of 100 difference. So it really makes a difference talking or not talking, singing or not singing. Then if you... then of course this triggered the question. I'm talking about maybe May last year, April, May, already in the scientific community, from how about should we, because we have all these studies, should we just look at large droplets and are people safe if you keep 1.5 meters from each other, or should we also look at ventilation and make more long distance transmission, especially in smaller and under-ventilated spaces? And so another way to pose this question is to ask, are aerosols really important or also important? There have been a lot of discussions with REHVA and also people from ASHRAE and ISHRAE, the Indian HVAC Society, together with people from IAQ, the International Society for Indoor Air Quality. We managed to arrange some meetings with WHO. And at first they were very reluctant to talk about this. People like Hugo Lee, for example, from Hong Kong University were involved, Lydia Maraska from Australia, Shelley Miller from the US. And at first, especially medical people, public health people, were very reluctant to talk about this. But I don't know. At the end, we came up with a summary of what we knew from science. And some of us already had experience with the previous SARS epidemic that actually helped to increase our tempo in terms of thinking about how to address this COVID pandemic. And so this led to this paper by Moravska and Milton that appeared at the beginning of July. This was published in Clinical Infectious Diseases, and it was actually signed by 239 people from all over the world. I was actually one of them. I know some people from Denmark were involved, Arsene Melikov, for example. And Basically, in the paper, we gave a lot of arguments and just to back up our statement that beyond any reasonable doubt, airborne droplets, aerosols, can pose a risk beyond the 2 meter or 1.5 meter distance that people normally advise. If you don't know this paper, just Google Moravska, Milton, and COVID and ventilation or aerosols, then you'll find it. So I think, yes, you can answer this question with yes, that in certain, not always, but in certain environments, aerosols, so indoor environments, smaller spaces, underventilated, especially if you stay there a long time with each other and by accident one of them is infected, then it really matters. How does it work? Well, it's not very difficult. If you have somebody in a space, in this case, let's assume the person to the right who's talking is infected, then this person spreads larger droplets and smaller droplets. And those larger droplets, they tend to fall to the ground within a meter, 1.5 meter, 2 meters. But smaller droplets, that they tend to just float in the air and stay there maybe for 1 or 2 hours, a couple of minutes to maybe even a few hours, depending upon the air currents, on whether you have good ventilation or not. So what happens if you have somebody infected in the room and there's no ventilation, like you see in this picture? Well, then the room starts to fill up with aerosols, and this other person to the left, even when he keeps 2 or 3 meter distance, still with every breath he takes, he will inhale a certain amount of aerosols and maybe viruses. So let's compare this to a situation where you ventilate well. In this case, it's with a window open. It could be with a mechanical system in the ceiling that is on. Then the concentration in the breathing zone of the person to the right will be much lower because the air is replenished every half hour or whatever your air exchange rate is. So if you do ventilate, you dilute the air. So with every breath this person takes, he takes in much less aerosols, much less viruses than when you, in the other situation, without any ventilation. And you can compare this if this other person is, I don't know, ate a lot of garlic and this person spreads garlic when talking, then if you are in a very small, very underventilated room, and maybe after 1 hour you go to the toilet and you walk back in the room, then you will smell the garlic. If you're in a very well ventilated room and you go to the toilet and after 1 hour you come back in the room, you won't smell the garlic. It's that simple. Or even if you go at 0.5 meter distance to the mouth of this person, you will always smell it, whether you're in a big or in a small room, well ventilated or non-well ventilated. So yes, it matters to keep distance, 1.5, 2 meter, but it also matters to have good ventilation. Sorry, I'm just clicking too fast here. When you talk about big versus small droplets, one thing I see, especially within the medical community, is that often people say, well, yes, what you say might be right, but the majority of what people spread, these are all large droplets that fall to the ground within 1 meter. So if we keep distance, also in a badly ventilated room, then we are safe. Well, in the picture to the left here, you see what kind of sizes of aerosols people spread when they talk, see above, or when they cough. And what you see here is that the majority is in the range of, well, 5 to 10, 20, 30. That's basically where it happens. And the theory is that anything larger than 5 micrometer falls to the ground very fast. The problem only is that this is a theory that goes back to the 30s, and we know now with the advanced equipment we have now, if you talk to any aerosol specialist that you might know, he or she can tell you this too. The problem is that we do know that, in real life, it depends a little bit on the situation, on the temperature, on the humidity, on the air currents in the room, but in real life it's not droplets up to already from 5 micron and above they fall to the ground, but it's in real life it's droplets from around 50 that really tend to fall to the ground pretty fast, and all the other droplets, they have a tendency to float in the air for at least a few minutes, but at least to go beyond this limit of 1 or 2 meter. And this is a famous professor in the Netherlands who's a specialist in aerosols, and he's been saying this over and over again in the newspapers, that we should stop thinking that anything bigger than 5 microns fall to the ground. Now, the majority of what you exhale or when you or that you spread when you talk is actually smaller than 50 microns, and this is something that will float in the air, and actually you can end up breathing in. Very, very important, I think. And anyhow, it has a lot to do with misinterpretation of some studies from the 30s, which of course is a long, long, long time ago, and we should not make thinking mistakes about this one. In this context, I think if you haven't seen this, there's another science talk from Joseph Allen from Harvard. I forgot the number, but the title you see here, The Importance of Indoor and Outdoor Climate in Relation to COVID-19. And what he says in this meeting is that the science is really clear, airborne transmission is happening, so he's implying that we should look at aerosols. He was talking about colleagues with a medical background from Harvard who told him, well, at first I thought it was not important, aerosols, but now I realize we got it wrong. We should also look at aerosols at long distance transmission. And he's saying that aerosol exposure is accounting for a large fraction of the transmission within society. So if you have a chance, go back and check it out. You can also find it on YouTube. Well, then in terms of policy, because if aerosols are important, then of course it would make sense to advise people not to just wash their hands, keep a distance, and maybe wear a mask, but also to tell them to make sure that spaces are well ventilated, especially if you meet people from outside your household, or if you, for example, meet colleagues at work, etc. Well, some countries, they've been quite advanced in this. In the Netherlands, we have this idea that we are very innovative and we move very fast, and that largely like just, I don't know, everything goes very slow. It's like an oil tanker or whatever. But one thing I've learned last year that it's actually the opposite. In the Netherlands, we talk and talk and talk without maybe making decisions, for example, with masks. And in a country like Germany, they somehow get things organized and they move much more faster in terms of deciding to wear masks, realizing that they should dive into science again and changing their policies about ventilation. So already just after last summer, the German government started to communicate through the Umweltbundesamt and also to the Robert Koch Institute, this is the Public Health Institute in Germany, that we should not just focus on masks and in German they call it Abstand halten, so 1.5 meter distance keeping, hygiene, washing hands, and Alltagsmasker, so wearing masks when you go to the shop, for example. But since summer, they also say plus L, so plus Luftung. So also you should look at ventilation. And if you see the big blue picture, you see somebody who's opening a window. There's actually an official poster from the website of the Public Health Institute, Robert Koch Institute. So in Germany, this is part of the overall advice. I don't know about Scandinavia, but you should really look at all, I think. Gabriel Jesus from the WHO also in a video said this, like we should not discuss about whether hand washing is more important than ventilation. We should do it all. If you haven't seen the documents from Germany, then I invite you to have a look at it. Then let's have a look where we were. I sometimes have some issues with my clicker here. Yeah, it's working again. That's good news because, like I said, the WHO maybe May last year still was quite reluctant to look at this other route, the aerosol route, at the aspect of ventilation. But they've changed their policy, and March 1st they released this document. It was actually made with some help from people from REHVA, from ASHRAE. The document is called Roadmap to Improve and Ensure Good Indoor Ventilation in the Context of COVID-19. And you can just download it. It has all kinds of flowcharts like you see to the right, where you can decide in a hospital or an office or a school or in people's homes what to do and how to check whether ventilation is okay and how to correct if the people use fans or not. One of the things they say in this document is that ideally one should try to make sure that at least there's fresh air supply of 10 liters per second per person. And they also warn against recirculation. If you do have recirculation, then they tell you, well, still make sure that at least you have this amount of fresh air supply. If you have a chance, have a look at this document. It's quite hands-on and it's really really useful, I think, especially for example, building operators, building managers. Then if I'm an engineer, I have a background in mechanical engineering, a PhD in building sciences, and of course engineers like to think in terms of solutions. I like that too. So, but it's good to first understand the theory before you start applying solutions. And so in the last part of my presentation, I would like to talk about what can we do about this. With this knowledge, what can we do, or what should we not do, and what should we do? In general, I think I would like to state that it does help to use this standard, we call it infection control pyramid. This is something that CDC from the US uses, but maybe some of you who have a background in occupational health and safety also recognize it as a standard occupation hygiene approach. So this actually works in all kinds of contexts, even when you expose people to chemicals, for example, in a factory context. But talking about infectious diseases, about viruses, this schedule basically tells you, it's further explained in this REHVA COVID document, that if possible, please keep the source out. So if you can, for example, in an office, you can convince people not to come to the office when they are ill, or if you even maybe test people before they come to the office. This, of course, is a little bit of a hassle. But then you do step one, elimination. That's the best. Second best is engineering controls, where you kind of try to separate sources with healthy people that are exposed. And then ventilation actually is an example of an engineering control measure. Third best is administrative controls, where you tell people, for example, that they can only have meetings over a maximum of half an hour. That could be an example of an administrative control. And a last resort should be personal protection. So when it's about noise, then of course it's covering your ears. And when it's about bad air quality, it's like putting something in front of your mouth. To be honest, in the COVID context, to wear a mask should be both at the last level, personal protective equipment, and at the first, because you also decrease the source strength at the source. So if you can talk people into wearing masks, also indoors. I see a lot of people that wear them outdoors. They wear them where they walk around in the corridor, in the office, or in the school. And then as soon as they sit for hours and hours on a row in one not big space with lots of others, then they take it off as if that is safe. Actually, that's more dangerous than walking on the corridor. But anyhow, so if you wear a mask, you do something on the elimination level, the first step, and on the fourth level, which is personal protective. So on the source side, but also on the receiving side. So it works double. So in that sense, it's a very effective measure to wear a mask. Of course, you have different types of masks. One mask is more effective than the other one. Some people make mistakes with wearing the mask, like they put their nose above it. But generally speaking, it's quite an effective measure. Also, and especially if you look at the aerosol route. Then if you talk about solutions, then of course, as a country or as a society, one has limited resources and you cannot do it all. So I personally think it would make sense to focus on those building contexts where we know a lot of cross-infections happen or have happened in the past. This is an analysis of a database from Koen Swinkel that I made mid-August. The database is still there. Of course, it has a lot of new information right now. And he gathered information from scientific papers, but also from high-quality newspapers like New York Times. He gathered descriptions of big outbreaks, so super spreading events. And then he put them all together, and then I counted how many of them were in nursing homes or in hospitals or in schools or in public transport, etc. Of course, this is not totally at random selection, but anyhow, it can tell you a little bit where the danger happens. And what you see on the left is that like medical buildings like hospitals, nursing homes, rehabilitation centers, but also prisons, meat industry facilities. I mean, we kind of knew this already this summer, that those environments are the ones that we should maybe focus on if you want to make create safety, and maybe also if you want to avoid in the future to have other super spreading events in relation to maybe future viruses. So, of course, you do see the schools here, and I'm pretty convinced that schools in real life are a little bit higher than what you see here. But, for example, nursing homes, not that many people are talking about nursing homes, and it's because we also kept them open during the pandemic. It's super important that we do it right and that we also do the ventilation part right in nursing homes. And too little people are thinking and talking about this. unfortunately. Okay, I'd like to do a little quiz with you. I'll be answering in your place. So when you talk about COVID and ventilation and aerosols, people think that classrooms are like a dangerous environment because you have all these children close to each other. Well, young children, of course, they spread less intensively viruses to others than adults do, but they still do. So people think that classrooms are like one of the most dangerous places, even though I know a lot of, especially in the Nordic countries and also here in the Netherlands, a lot of relatively new classrooms, they're pretty well ventilated. Air exchange rate of 6, which means then every hour you kind of 6 times rechange the air. Often they're ventilated. So the definition that a class is very badly, if you then, I was just talking about the mechanical system in the school. If you also keep the windows some open, you can go up to maybe an air exchange rate of 10. So classrooms can be bad, but they often are pretty okay too. So it's definitely not a dangerous place if you about COVID transmission, despite what a lot of people think. How about this one? So if you have poop, this is from driving lessons. This has been a big discussion in the Netherlands. Can we do this safe? And if we just put some perspex, if you are with people, 2 people from different households, think, for example, of sports teams that go to an away game and sit in a car together for 1 hour. To be in a car without mask on, without windows open now and then, and without the mechanical ventilation system in one of the high-end setting, I mean, it's very dangerous because it's a very small space, and the space fills up pretty fast with not just CO2 but also viruses or aerosols. So if you drive in a car with people from outside the household, it really makes sense to not just wear a mask, but also to make sure there's enough ventilation, that you use all the appliances in the car. A lot of people are not aware of this, but cars are really not the best environment during a pandemic. Well, down below now you think, of course, this is like the most dangerous situation you can think of. It's a lot of people together, and this is a typical environment where one infected person can infect maybe 20, 30, 50 others. Well, I have news for you. If you talk about aerosols and ventilation, this picture was taken 3 days ago. Sorry. Actually, I was there myself. On the front, you see a few people from the Radboud University. This is a big field experiment going on in the Netherlands. This was the last one. So they built a mini festival. We had 1,500 people there. Everybody was tested 2 days before and will be tested 2 days from now, like 5 days after. And including all the musicians and whatever, everybody who was there, people doing the light was tested. We had the minister there too. The minister was tested. So we had 15 tested before and after. And apart from that, we made sure that this environment, it's a tent this is in, and actually the tent is open on one side. So we calculated that fresh air supply in this specific situation was up to 1,000 cubic meter per person. Well, normally if it's 50, it's already pretty okay. So this actually is definitely not as dangerous as it looks like, and I'm personally convinced that, especially if you combine it with testing, that we can do these kind of things quite safely already. Even though a lot of countries, including the English, they have a lot of critique on us doing these kind of experiments. I personally think it's very important for young people that you can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that we can have these kind of concerts. On the podium, it's actually Maan, it's one of the famous young Dutch new artists. Then, if you talk about bars and nightclubs or whatever, so the picture to the right, I mean, often these spaces are not too well ventilated. If you look careful on this picture, you see one air inlet, but that's definitely not enough for all of these people. So these kind of situations, if you have a restaurant, you have outside sitting or whatever, I think it can be pretty okay if you look at ventilation and aerosols. But in this kind of cases, I would recommend this owner to invest in more advanced and new ventilation system. And of course, this costs money, so maybe they should be helped. I know in Germany, for example, they have a big budget for people who want to improve their ventilation systems. In the Netherlands, we have that too, but just for schools, school ventilation. Then this is the last example I want to give. If you have like a birthday party and people are coming, of course, nowadays it's limited the amount of people you can receive at home. But if you have more if you have people from other households coming in your living room. Living rooms normally are not ventilated very well. I mean, an air exchange rate of 0.5 or something, so it means it takes 2 hours before the air is refreshed. It's often, especially in the winter, it's really a problem. If you don't open the window, if you have people visiting you at home, my tip is to, if they're from outside your household, to keep it short and to make sure that on the front and on the back side you have something open, and then at least your ventilation rate can go up to maybe 20, maybe 5 or 6, or if you're lucky, 10. It depends, of course, on the wind. Then I would like to zoom in a little bit on nursing homes. I've personally been involved the last couple of months in some investigations in nursing rooms in the area where I live. I live in Rotterdam, The Hague. I work in The Hague. And what we see is that it's not all right. In Dutch you say, when everything is super all right, you say everything is koek en ei, cookie and egg. Of course, this is not a real translation. But I think that ventilation in nursing homes is not always not always as it should be. Let me put it that way. And this is troublesome, I think, because during a pandemic, but also in winter when there's influenza pandemics in nursing homes, this is where people live. I mean, you cannot take them out. If there's a problem in an office, you can tell people to work at home. But in a nursing home, this is where people live. And so I think there's an option to make sure that also in nursing homes, ventilation is right. And there's, for example, in the Netherlands, we have a lot of money to improve ventilation in schools, but not in nursing homes. And I, as taxpayer, I don't understand that. That's maybe because they think those old people don't vote anymore. I don't know. But anyhow, what kind of problems do we see in nursing homes? Of course, at the start of the pandemic, they had some problems with masks. So a lot of hospitals did have masks, but they did not provide them to nursing homes. So people working there could not protect themselves. That was already the start. You often see that the fresh air supply is not designed with high amounts in mind. Sometimes windows are not operable, so if you want to ventilate extra because there have been a little accident, maybe with people, you know what I mean. On the dementia department, there could be some accidents with people going to the toilet in the wrong place. Sometimes there is enough fresh air supply, but there are problems with draft or cold. Because the air intakes are not designed rightly. So people then, of course, ask, can you please shut it off because I'm cold? And then, of course, they're not cold anymore, but you don't have enough fresh air. And we also see really, basic stuff going wrong. And recently, the picture to the right is actually from a real project we recently did. And the system, when we were there was no fresh air supply whatsoever, not in the individual rooms of people, but also not in the communal meeting rooms, living rooms of the people living in this nursing home. And the system was off and nobody recognized this, and it had been off for at least a few weeks when we were there. And I'm talking this winter, so we are in a COVID pandemic, and there are nursing rooms where systems are not on and nobody is finding it out. We were there kind of by accident doing this investigation. And one last remark about nursing homes: people think that they are designed and operated and maintained as professional as you do in hospitals, and this is not true. It's totally different. I compared hospitals it's comparing rugby to playing table tennis. It's both about people who are not ultimately well, but the technology in a hospital, the HVAC technology in a hospital is very advanced, and they can spend up to 1,000 euro per square meter. But the nursing home, in terms of technology, it's more like in a standard office. And if you're lucky, in a good office, and if you're unlucky, in a not very well designed and maintained office building. This is a European study where they also looked at, from 6 years ago, they looked at nursing homes, and they focused on the communal homes. So you have individual people's rooms, but you also have where they, during the day, sit and drink coffee all together, etc. So like the communal living room, where they often sit with 10, 20 people. And they had some ventilation measurements. In this case, they looked at whether they had at least 5 liters per second per person. I think it's a little low. It should have been maybe, but it was maybe 70, 80%, sometimes 100% of the rooms they looked at, they did not have enough fresh air, not at least this minimum of 5 liters per second per person. With one exception, Sweden, So Sweden, in all the rooms, all the 55 rooms they look at, in all the rooms there was enough fresh air supply. And I do know that in Sweden they do much more with periodic testing and checking of fresh air supply in buildings, also in homes. Which one here gold, and the rest all won not even wooden medal, you can say. Well, if I see these kind of studies, then it's, also the international community, people like to study offices because it's related to productivity, and schools because it's related to young children, to the future. But this is a little bit of a forgotten corner. So in this context, I would like to refer to Gandhi, who said that if you want to measure how fair a society is, you should look at how it treats its most vulnerable members. So I'll let you think a little bit about this. Well, I would like to end with some concrete advice. If you are in charge of a specific building, or you're maybe involved in a newly designed project, if you're interested in nursing homes, unfortunately we don't have it in English yet, but the left is like a graphic we made for nursing homes, and actually you can click on it, and then it gives some more in-depth advice. But especially the thing that is indicated here on the right, this is the REHVA COVID document. We started with the first version in March last year, and this is the version 4 from November, a few months ago. And it gives some practical recommendations, especially for existing buildings, what to do with recirculation, with toilet ventilation, with advice in relation to window opening use, with air quality monitoring. So I recommend you to go to rehva.eu and then just look for the REHVA COVID document. We also have an online course with REHVA, so you can, if you want to dive even further into it, you can do this online course. So if you are interested, please go to rehva.eu and you'll find this more specific information about solutions, things you can do in existing buildings or also new buildings. This is nearly my last slide. For the designers amongst you, if you are involved or soon will be involved in a renovation project or new designs, I just have a few very simple tips. I realized this morning that I forgot one important one, is like, if you do design a building, don't forget about the outdoor spaces. So if you have an office building, it would be nice to also have a balcony or maybe a rooftop garden or whatever, so people are not always forced, even when the weather is nice, to sit inside and to have meetings, for example. So make sure you also design outdoor spaces. That's maybe tip number 6. But apart from that, what I see often in projects is that at the last moment, people want to save money and they first look at the invisible, the indoor air quality. And then, of course, they start to shave off 10 or 20% of the cost on the ventilation system, whether it's natural or mechanical. And that's really often where problems start. So don't do that. Second tip. If you start having discussions about like, if we look at infectious diseases and COVID, is it better to have operable windows or is it better to have mechanical supply? The real answer is the best is to have both. So you have a mechanical system with maybe air inlets in the ceiling that supply the air, no matter what, also when there's no wind outside, etc., or when it's really cold outside. But sometimes you use a space with more people than planned, and then it's good to have a second option for extra ventilation by opening a window. So if you want to make a good design of a school, an office, a practice room for a chorus or whatever, make sure you have mechanical supply and or exhaust in combination with natural. This costs a little bit extra, but this is how you make a safe environment in terms of ventilation. Third tip. Try to avoid all air systems that use central recirculation, especially outside Europe. I often see that systems are designed just with air. So you have like air who's pumped around in a building, and this air is also used to supply cooling or to supply heating to the room. In Europe, we have a long history of separating these two. So you have one system that makes sure it's warm enough or cold enough at room level, for example, with radiators or maybe floor slab cooling, climate ceilings. And you have a separate system that makes sure enough air is coming in, often a constant volume system. So if you can do that, that's always better than to just select an all-air system, because with an all-air system, and sometimes you kind of are forced to decide to stop using a lot of fresh outdoor air, because otherwise you get problems on the temperature side. So if you have the option to avoid an all-air system, that I know I'm not making friends on all sides now saying this, but I'm saying this on personal behalf, maybe not on the REHVA behalf, I should say. Then if you have a choice, I think if there's spaces that you use 1 or 2 hours, think for example of a restaurant, and you can make them a little bit higher than normal, because if you have a high volume, so I'm not just talking about mechanical ventilation, but about the room volume, that helps, because then it takes much more time before the space fills up with viruses, in case there is somebody in the room, with aerosols. So ceiling height, and I know that architects love it when I say these kind of things, but it really helps not to have too low ceilings, especially when you do things that are extra negatively impact the air quality. For example, if you sport, because then your metabolism is much higher, but also if you sing or when you're partying with a lot of noise. So if you ask me, a nightclub should have a requirement of having ceilings of at least 5 meter high or whatever, and often they don't. And last tip, if you do design a system, make sure that you build something in which helps you to keep the environment safe, and especially indoor air quality monitoring system. On the picture to the right, you see the small device, which is like a CO2 traffic light, so it kind of recognizes when CO2 goes above 800 or 1000 ppm. And of course, you can also hang this in a cloud and automate this and connect it to the building management system. But that's relatively cheap nowadays, and it really works quite well to create more safety in relation to ventilation and indoor air quality. Okay, let's jump to my last slide. I'd like to end with some tips for for you personally. I mean, you all know the standard advice: stay home when ill, keep distance to others, wear your mask, wash your hands. And I think a really important one with reference to this standard German advice, AHAL. If possible, if you meet people from other households, do it outside, do it in an outside space, or if you do it inside, make sure you ventilate. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so very much for that. Absolutely brilliant. And I have so many questions. I can tell you that our audience, they're happy, and their comments are, they basically consist of singing your praises. So I'll start with asking questions, and then you can embrace the praise and jubilation from the audience. I'll ask you a few questions, because one thing that came to, or has been puzzling me for the past 12 months, at least, if not more, is why the reluctance, do you think, from one part of the scientific world to listen to another part of the scientific world when it came to how to prevent the spread of COVID, the reasons for spread, etc. I'm alluding to the aerosol theme that actually took quite long before it became accepted, as you also said. Why do you think there was such a reluctance?
Yeah, I think, I don't know this 100%, but I think there are a few aspects. Joseph Allen actually also talked about this, and rightly so. He said that one assumption on the non-technical side is that if you want to do something with ventilation, you kind of have to reorganize all existing buildings. While the examples I gave, often it's quite simple. You just tell people to open a window when you drive a car, or you tell people who run a restaurant to have it checked that it's in the right setting when people are indoors. And so I think on the policy side and also on the medical side, people were maybe thinking, well, if we allow this new thing in ventilation, then this will lead to a lot of extra cost, and it's complicated and people don't know how to do it, and then we're forced to invest an incredible amount of money, which is not true. I think in many situations you can do a lot with simple things, just checking whether systems are on, putting in a CO2 sensor on the wall that maybe costs 200 euros, and opening a window a little bit more often, opening a window on the front side and the back side when you have somebody visiting you. Some of these things are super simple. So that's one thing. Another thing, I think I've had discussions with people from the public health side, and they say things like, but in the 30s, we already found out that it's all about large droplets. And then I tell them, well, okay, stop. Talk to people who are specialists in aerosols. I know some people who work in aircraft industry, for example, because if you design an aircraft or a space item, then you really have to think about this because you put a lot of people in small space. And they all say, everybody who knows something, so they say kind of what I just said with the large droplets and the small droplets. And I think the real problem here is that we start to live in societies where people, I don't know, they think more and more black and white. And this also happens, unfortunately, I think, in the scientific community, where people have trouble really listening to each other. And I'll end with one example. Somebody I know from Radboud University, he's a specialist in accidents. So if you have, for example, in Rotterdam where I live, there's a fire in a ship with a chemical load, then of course you have to find a solution pretty fast. He says, well, what often happens is that there's the mayor and there's only the firemen, and they talk with each other and make a decision. If you want to have a good decision, you have to call in a few other people that know about weather, about chemical reactions, about communication, etc. And then this group together that have partly shared knowledge, but also not shared knowledge. And if they together really listen to each other and then come with a good solution, that's normally the way out of a crisis, and a fast way out of the crisis. And yeah, I personally think that we really missed a lot of opportunities by, now it's happening slowly, but by just not listening to each other and diving into each other's arguments. And this I'm a very impatient person, and I've had tough times now and then the last couple of months.
You must have. I think we're a few, and I think it's a very, very salient point, because I think the first point in terms of the fear of costs. One hypothesis that I pondered was actually whether it was the fear of recognizing new insights. So that sometimes you can feel quite safe in that knowledge, and you're leaning on a foundation of knowledge, and you're saying, we know this was the epitome, or this is what we realized in the 30s, we're basing it on that. So that was one of my hypotheses at some point. Was there actually a fear of accepting this new piece of scientific evidence that it's different? We do have aerosols. It didn't reach the Danish media till it was a few weeks after I had interviewed Joseph Allen, and I'm sorry to say it wasn't because of my interview, but then it started surfacing in the media in Denmark. At that point, as Joe said, he had been working more or less 24/7 since February last year in trying to push that observation and fact.
I recognize that, and it's policymakers and scientists, they're all human. I mean, if you don't know it, you just go back to what you already know and what you were thinking last year. And I think a little bit more flexibility would have helped us to sooner, fight more effectively against the pandemic.
Exactly. And just then to your other point in terms of the being able to collaborate, cross-collaboration and conversation, I would agree with you. And another point that you're also raising in terms of the nursing homes, they are not treated the same ways as hospitals. And it would actually be, there are cheap ways to improve the indoor quality. I think it's also an important takeaway, and thank you for that. Apart from your tips and recommendation, we do have a question, namely, how do you make sure that you have good air quality and temperature where you live and work? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, it starts with knowing how good or bad your outdoor air quality is, because your indoor air quality is affected by your local outdoor air quality. Luckily, a lot of cities and countries now have these outdoor air sensor networks and websites where they share the information. Sometimes it's even on the news, or it's on screens. If you drive to the center of Paris, you can see screens on the street. And I also see a lot of community. Actually, the community where I live in, we also build our own. It's like a citizen science kind of outdoor air particle measurement system. apart from that, you can also, of course, monitor your own indoor climate. I have one example here. I'm monitoring my own right now. It's just me and the cat who's making this, so it's
because you know how to read it. You've met Lone Pfeiffer earlier today, our sustainability director from Velux, and she also has a device wherever we go. And I keep saying to her, but you can read it, you can interpret what it says. So for those of us with a social scientific background, an artsy background, whatever, just all of us not educated to read it. What do we do when we have that device?
Actually, this device also has a small traffic light, so it kind of, you can program it. So you have to make sure it's programmed right, giving what you want to do. But then if you see that it goes to red, for example, classrooms, they often have this. So it's so you just don't only have the number, you also have a traffic light color. Personally, I have this fantasy that maybe 5 or 10 years from now we'll have wearables that actually measure maybe CO2 in the air, something you just put around your wrist, that measure particles and that warn you. I mean, I've seen a few products from China that you can put on your belt, but and one from France that you can actually put on your backpack. But even smaller than that, something you put here or there, and that will warn you, or maybe even make if you have like a mask that automatically comes on as soon as it detects that it's not right. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we maybe will see the next 5 years happening.
I hope so, because as you said, we have the sick building syndrome. We also have the anecdotal headache. And it would be really nice to have devices that can warn us before we have the headache, before we leave a building saying, my God, it was nice to get outside. There's more praise to you from the audience. They're saying thank you for a great presentation. I have asked, and we've talked now for our time, so in respect of people watching us, because we've promised that we would finish on time, and I would also like to keep that promise. But to you, I'd like to say a huge thank you. I think this has been not only really insightful, but also a delightful pleasure to have you with us today. I hope to see you here physically when we can travel again. I think you have also reminded us all that we can actually focus and strategize in trying to ensure healthy lives when we're inside buildings during a global pandemic. And for that, thank you very, very much. For those of you watching, joining us today, a huge thank you. I hope that you have enjoyed it just as much as me. It seems to be from the comments, so I'm delighted. It is. It's not every day that we have a speaker of your format and experience and reference. So just thank you for taking time out to visit us and spending time with us today, Atze. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.